Well, thank you guys again. I've been here once before, and it was a lot of fun talking about creation. And I think before I talked specifically about evolution and the Darwinian mechanism. But today, there's something new out in physics. And when I first heard about it, it's actually really new, about 2 or 3 years old. And it's this idea that the universe isn't really real. There's nothing solid in the universe. It's all kind of a computer projection or a hologram or even a mental projection. And when I first heard about this as a physics student was giving a lecture on this, and it kind of went over everybody's heads mostly, and I was like, I think that's a great idea, but I think I could do a better job with this. So hopefully I do. But it's fascinating that the basic concept reminded me a lot of what the Bible says about the nature of reality. So let's start a little bit with the Bible and what the Bible says, and then we'll go into the physics and see what the physicists are saying and see if they kind of match. And I think it's going to be very interesting. It's certainly interesting for me. And it's kind of a passion of mine. If I could do this full time and actually make a living at it, this is what I would prefer to do. So consider that nothing that you see, feel, touch in 5 senses is actually real. Even time isn't real as far as what you think is independent reality. It doesn't have its own reality. Nothing that you can taste, touch, see has its own independent reality. According to the Bible. For the Bible says that all God has to do is speak and things pop into existence. He said, well, let there be light, poof, there was light, right? Let there be trees, poof, there's trees. Let there be animals, poof. God has this magical ability to speak and things pop into existence. And nobody else has that ability. I certainly don't. I wish I had the ability. And then the Bible goes beyond that. It makes some extraordinary claims that are really quite bizarre, if you think about it. Paul in Acts, for example, he says, from one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. That's a really bizarre statement. He marked out their appointed time in history. It's almost like he knows history before it happens, and he kind of determines it even. God does this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from any one of us. And this is really bizarre, because it says, for in him we live and move and have our being. As some of our own poets have said, we are his offspring. Now, a lot of people, before very recent times, thought that this statement was kind of figurative, but maybe it's actually literal. In him we live and move and have our being. So let's look at this a little more. God is often, or a lot of times in the Bible, referred to as the Word, especially Jesus. And Jesus is debating with the devil here out in the desert. He says, Jesus answered Satan, and he said, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. In other words, Jesus is saying bread is not as literal or as solid as the word of God. It's kind of secondary. It is itself dependent upon the word. And pretty much nobody got this for a long time, except for one guy. It's a centurion. This is to me, it's one of the most amazing stories in the Bible, because the centurion was very, very bright. Jesus is saying, hey, I'll heal your servant. Just show me the way. I'll go to your house and I'll lay my hands on him and say the magic words and he'll be healed, right? And the centurion said, what's the big deal, right? Just say the word, right? Just say the word and my servant will be healed. Because he says, I'm a man of authority. I say go, and my servant goes. I say come, and he comes. Hey, you're a God, right? You're a man of authority too. All you have to do is say the word, and it will happen. This is amazing. And Jesus was shocked by this because nobody else had gotten it before this point in time. It took his disciples quite some time. After the resurrection, some of his disciples started to get it, and eventually all of them, I think, got it. But especially John. If you start reading the first chapter of John, John is the most metaphysical gospel in the Bible. Because John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He constantly describes Jesus as the Word. And through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. And then the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. So he's saying the Word actually wasn't physical before he came to this planet and dwelt among us. The Word was metaphysical, beyond physical, which is mind-bending in a way. Also, Paul goes on in Colossians, he says, he is before all things, and in him, again, in him, all things hold together. So, again, everything physical is dependent upon the Word, and it's basically information that is primary. Paul says he sustains all things by the power of his Word. It's not because some physical thing that he does. He just speaks it and it happens, and he maintains it by his Word. So this is really bizarre. It's one thing for the Bible or any book, any religious claim to make a fantastic claim like this, but what is actually evidence? Is there actually reasonable evidence for this, physical evidence, scientific evidence? So what are scientists discovering lately along these lines? Well, first of all, we've known for quite some time, since Einstein, that mass is made from energy. Mass does not have its independent existence. It's built upon energy, raw energy, which is somewhat of a bizarre concept. It was certainly bizarre when Einstein first came up with E equals mc squared. It's hard to think that matter is really based upon some non-physical thing like energy, but they're interchangeable. And what's also interesting is that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only changed from one form into another form. So energy itself is the basis of all information. Energy itself is based on information. This is more, Einstein did not understand this particular point. This was discovered after Einstein, and it's a fairly recent discovery in physics, that actually the universe itself looks like a computer program. It's pixelated, like pixels on a computer screen. And the fundamental pixels of the universe are based on information, or quanta. It's the quantum theory of physics. And like energy, Shannon information, or the basic quanta information of the universe, cannot be created or destroyed by us humans anyway. In other words, the underlying computer-like matrix cannot be created or destroyed. We can only kind of modify certain things, but we can't actually change or destroy the underlying matrix itself, the computer program, if you will. So Leonard Susskind, he's a professor of theoretical physics at Stanford. He says, in short, the world is like a ghostly, three-dimensional illusion cast by a hologram, or a holographic universe, if you've heard that concept before. And it's hard to, again, wrap your mind around that, but this is what physicists are starting to talk about. And it's kind of like a projection. Like how can you tell that you're not living in a computer program or some sort of projected reality? You can't really tell if you're part of that projection. So how do physicists come up with this idea? This is Seth Lloyd, who's a professor of mathematical engineering at MIT. And here's just a little video clip of what he's talking about along these lines.
I've argued that the universe is effectively a quantum computer. In fact, not even effectively, actually is a quantum computer.
So a quantum computer, what's he talking about? He's basically talking, like I just said, the universe is based on quantum mechanics, is based on a finite number of pixels or informational locations, and everything is based on that. And there's gazillions of them, but there's not an infinite number of them. It's a finite number. And the computer, the universe runs on these pixels. So, again, it's based entirely on information, and it's been fairly recent. Since November of 2012, the concept of a holographic universe, or a computerized projection of reality, has kind of come to the forefront. And it seems to gain the weight of evidentiary support in physics, however bizarre it may be. So far, the best available evidence seems to suggest more and more that both matter and space-time are quantized or pixelated, as in the smallest possible region of information on the pixels of a computer screen. So what does this mean? So here's some physicists talking about the implications of this and how it relates to, you realize that most physicists believe in some sort of higher power. It may not be the Christian God, but some sort of higher power behind it all, which is a lot different than biologists. And I've often thought to myself, well, maybe physicists are just brighter than biologists. But anyway, no offense. After all, I majored in biology, not physics. So.
Then somehow one is more real than the other. The instruction is the reality, the realization of the instruction, the video game is the illusion. How do you get away from that? Ed first and then Seth.
Okay. Well, the more interesting aspect to that question is who's the programmer and where's the computer?
And that the true nature of the universe is indeed digital, that we have smallest space, smallest time, and that there's nothing that you cannot compute. And at the moment, there is no evidence against that.
The holographic principle tells us something quite astonishing. It says that our ideas of volume, of the real world in a sense, might be a kind of illusion.
The future, at least of this development, will be that we start actually with information. So information is going to be our starting point. And space-time is not something that we start with. We forget about what space is and what time. And then somehow the information, by thinking about how much information is, what information is doing, then the space-time will, what we call, be emergent. It will come out of just a bunch of zeros and ones.
For a quantum theory of gravity is that space-time is not fundamental. That space-time is, if you like, an effective emergent description from something else that underlies it. And that something else could be information.
It should be clear that this whole holographic story is the most radical thing that has happened to our understanding of space, time, matter, since the invention of quantum mechanics and relativity.
So it kind of begs the question, if you have a computer program, who made it, right? And usually when we think of computer programs and simulations, we think of an intelligent designer for that. We don't know of any computer that just pops into existence by itself. And certainly the information needed to program that computer. So it's starting, for me at least, to sound rather biblical. Because in Hebrews 11:3 it says, "By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what is visible. It's made out of something invisible." And what physicists are talking about seems to match that idea or that claim. But what does this imply? It has some really dramatic implications. First of all, for most physicists, it implies strongly that God exists. And we'll get into that more in a little bit. But the only known source of qualitatively new forms of meaningful or functional information, at least beyond very low levels of functional complexity, is a pre-existent intelligent mind. If everything that exists is ultimately based on or derived from an underlying meaningful information alone, then this implies the origin of this meaningful information is an intelligent mind. So the argument that meaningful or functional information can create itself out of nothing is really nonsensical and opposed to all testable scientific observations, despite the claims of some fairly recent high-level physicists, which I'll get into that in a bit too. So that's what most physicists are actually claiming. So what's the best counter-argument in physics? Anybody know of Stephen Hawking? He recently published a book, and in this book called The Grand Design in 2010, he made this, to me, astounding argument. He says, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason that there is something rather than nothing. Why the universe exists, why we exist. It is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue torch paper and set the universe going. So, but most physicists are not convinced by this claim, despite however famous and bright Stephen Hawking is, and he's a genius. But why is Stephen Hawking's argument here not convincing to most physicists? Well, first of all, notice that quantum theory isn't really based on something coming from nothing. Even Stephen Hawking says that because gravity exists, right? Well, that's not nothing, right? He starts with something. Gravity exists. Well, what's he starting with? How can gravity exist? Well, gravity can only exist in quantum theory if you already have the matrix established. In other words, all the information underlying the universe is there. The computer is there. All the fine-tuned features of the universe, all the dials are already there. The computer is set up. So if you start with that, you're not starting with nothing. That's a pretty big computer you're starting with, right? So this is a big problem for this argument of Stephen Hawking. And so how does Stephen Hawking get around this? Because he's still, he's fine. Okay, well, I'm starting with something. I'm starting with the quantum computer. So then how does he get around the idea that God doesn't have to exist? Well, it's called the M theory. And it turns out that our universe is very finely tuned. It's like a Goldilocks universe. It's perfectly balanced. I mean, extremely balanced to support life. There's this one particular aspect called the cosmological constant, and it's a gravitational force that makes everything expand away from each other at just the right rate. And it has to be perfectly balanced to one part in 10 to the 120. 10 to the power of 120. That's 120 zeros. 1 divided by 10 with 120 zeros after it. Right? That's a tiny fraction. It's perfectly balanced. Right? Well, then you have a bunch of other ones, cosmological constants. Overall, and more of these are being discovered over time. But currently, the fine-tuned nature of the universe is 1 over 10 to the 500. That's 500 zeros after it, and it's a tiny, extremely fine-tuned universe. And for most physicists, this is like if you blow up a 747 or a junkyard, it lands at 747. That's easier to explain statistically than this 1 over 10 to the 500. And so for most physicists, this strongly indicates a God. So how does Stephen Hawking get around this? He says, well, there's 1 to 10 to 500 other universes, right? And ours just happen to turn out right? Because statistically, bound, if you set the dials randomly, one of them is bound to turn out right? So this has convinced some people. I'm not surprised. Richard Dawkins is very convinced by this. Surprise, surprise. He says, Darwinism kicked God out of biology, but physics remained more uncertain. Hawking is now administering the coup de grace. Right? Oh man, this M theory, that solves it all. It kicks God right out of the equation. So here's Brian Greene. He's an American theoretical physicist and a string theorist, and he's interviewing Richard Dawkins, and he's talking to him about the universe and God and things like that, which I found very interesting. And we'll get more into the M theory in a bit. But I just want you to listen to what I think are conflicting answers from Richard Dawkins regarding these things. And so here's a few clips.
So he argues that it's therefore much more likely, just based on the statistics, that we are in a simulated universe than that we're not in a simulated universe. So I wrote about this in a book that spoke about various ways in which you can imagine other universes. The surprise for me was people came back and said to me, and then Nick, I read later, people said to him too, this for them was the most convincing argument for a creator. Because now the creator was not some mysterious being. It was some futuristic teenage kid with pimples in his garage who just created the universe. So, my question to you, what do you think about that?
I can't see how you could refute it. I mean, I can't see how you would actually be sure that we're not
If a religion were to rise up, where people were honoring the teenage kid, would you go around and say, I get it, you can't refute it, and I'm kind of okay with it?
I wouldn't worship him.
No, I agree with that. That I could have guessed from the outset. But in that situation, where it's less like fairies, it's less like, ghosts, it's less of this crazy ideas.
Yes.
There's actually a logical sequence of words that can be given,
yes,
meaning where there is a creator to this world,
what do you say then? Yeah, I agree. I'm not so at ease with that as you seem to be, because it does seem to me that if there is a supernatural, superhuman intelligence that worked it all out, in a way that undermines the entire scientific enterprise, because we are, maybe an evolutionary biologist feels this more strongly, the whole enterprise of evolutionary biology is to explain how you get prodigious complexity and design from virtually nothing. I mean, we hand over to physicists when we can go beyond the virtually nothing to the absolutely nothing. If the deistic God thought all that through and set up the laws of physics, then he would have to be damn clever. He would have to be the physicist to end all physicists. I don't care if he then withdraws. He needs an explanation in his own right. And it seems to me that the noble scientific enterprise is to start from as near nothing as you can get.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's think about this a little bit. You can't disagree with the idea of a designer of the universe, because it seems like actually there's no real basis to actually argue against the concept that there may be a designer of the universe, even from Dawkins' perspective. And physics seems fairly compelling that this is most likely true, that there's some kind of designer. Yet he argues that the designer, the concept of a designer, even a teenage designer in some futuristic computer program, would undermine the very concept of science. Yet where is the idea that science cannot detect a designer? Where is that in any scientific methodology out there? Science is supposed to take you where the evidence leads, even if the evidence points to a designer. So how can Dawkins say science cannot detect a designer, even if a designer exists? Because it undermines the basis of science. How does that make any sense? And where has this ever been observed where Dawkins claims that complexity, high levels of complexity, or even something from nothing, how has that ever been observed? Something from nothing? Absolutely nothing? Never. Not even in quantum observations has it ever been observed. And also complexity. Let's say you have something, can you make it more complex than it started with? Your computer or any sort of information-based system, even in biology, there are certain key limitations, which I don't have time to go into, but certainly levels of complexity don't go beyond very low levels by any mindless process. It always takes intelligence to generate a higher level of complexity. There's also the idea that there's essentially an infinite number of universes within an eternal quantum matrix, which Dawkins accepts. He believes in an eternal quantum matrix that forms almost infinite numbers of universes, 1 times 10 to the 500 universes, because he believes Hawking's argument, but he has some problems with the idea that God can be infinite. He doesn't like the idea that God is infinite, because he says even if a designer exists, the designer would have to have evolved from nothing, right? So, but he has no problem with the matrix existing for eternity, which seems to be kind of bizarre. Why do you have a problem with an eternal God that's actually intelligent existing for eternity, but you have no problem with a mindless computer existing for eternity? See, that's really kind of not consistent. Also, the idea that it undermines reality or science itself. He argues that a creator, if a creator existed who made the universe, would undermine science itself. Let me ask you, let's say you have 10 to the 500 universes out there, and we're here in our world, and all of a sudden Arnold Schwarzenegger wins the California lottery 50 times in a row, right? And we're saying, I think it's rigged, right? I think there's some hanky-panky going on here. There's some politics or whatever, and this is rigged. Statistically, this doesn't seem likely that this would happen truly by random chance. And then he comes back and says, well, we're just in the right universe, right? These things, basically the argument that there's 10 to the 500 universes, and this is why life is able to pop into existence, or these very unlikely things happen, that's what undermines science. Because science is based on what? Statistical odds. Science, if your theory doesn't have a statistical basis that proves, or at least suggests, that this theory is more likely to happen than that theory, more likely to be true, then you really have no scientific hypothesis. It's not testable, it's not statistically calculable, you have no scientific hypothesis. And so, when you have an argument that basically undermines statistics itself, you have an argument that undermines science. And this is why Hawking is not taken seriously in this argument, and this is also why Dawkins is not taken seriously in his argument either, by at least a lot of thinking physicists. So because this argument is what undermines science, not the design hypothesis, because we can detect design with science. This is what forensics is based on, this is what anthropology is based on. Science is able to detect design, and it's used all the time in mainstream sciences. So, but the multi-universe hypothesis, that's never used in real science, ever. So, here's some more implications, interviews with Dawkins from some other people.
If you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology, you might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe.
But you're crazy to say it's God.
Heavy. Yeah. Yes, you can say it's anything you want, men from outer space, Martians, anything you want, but not God. Cannot be God. Right. It's not allowed to be God.
Right.
So what's the problem with God? Richard Dawkins has no problem with the teenage designer or some other alien designer for the whole universe. Just don't call it God. Why not? What's the problem with God? Or the concept of God from Richard Dawkins' perspective, or any perspective like that who wants to be agnostic or atheistic.
They are so closed-minded,
Yes.
and it really, I got the feeling from the movie that it's really not about science.
No, it's about them.
It's anti-God. They cannot allow God to be a part of anything.
Right, because if there's a God, then they might be judged. If there's a God who holds you accountable for your actions, you're in a lot of trouble. Now, I'm going to be the first to agree, I'm in a lot of trouble too. But there's a lot, but they cannot admit that there's a possibility of sin or a possibility of morality, and they can't agree on this basic thing. If man is just a speck of dust struck by lightning and then turned into a human being, then he has no moral responsibility. If we're all children of God, we have some moral responsibility because we all have some little piece of God in us. Yeah. That scares them to death. Okay.
So that's the only thing I can figure is why you wouldn't want to have a God, is because if there really is a God, not some pimply teenage kid in his garage in the future making the universe, now all of a sudden you're morally responsible to that God for your actions. So beyond that, again, there's certain things even Dawkins would recognize as requiring design. Certain things that nature, mindless nature, or natural mechanisms cannot explain. Here's just some random examples. Can random, mindless, natural mechanisms explain that? Could that be designed? Could I set those sticks like that? I could, right? Make them look random. But can that also be washed up on the beach by waves or whatever? Yeah. How about that?
No, that's
how do you know?
That's design.
Right? Would you think Richard Dawkins would recognize that as design? He would. I bet you he would. And maybe if he twisted his arm, he would. What about that? If you came across a creek and all those stones were stacked up like that, you think they just washed in like that? How do you know?
That's all design.
What about that?
That's it.
How can you tell the difference between the rocks down below and that round rocks on the top?
That's uniform. The other goes
So
scattered.
there's certain things that you know have to be designed, regardless. That even Richard Dawkins would recognize. So What's the difference with life, living things? Is life easier to explain from a mindless perspective, naturalistic mechanism? I don't have time to get a lot into it, but I'm telling you it's not easier to explain than stacked rocks and stacked wood. What about the universe? The fine-tuned features of the universe? Let me tell you, the simplest living thing is statistically less probable or more fine-tuned than the entire universe. 10 to the 500, 1 in 10 to the 500. And yet, this fine-tuned features of the universe, and we're just a small speck. There's 200 known galaxies in the visible universe. We haven't got to the edge of the visible universe yet. And within each of those 200 billion galaxies, there's between 100 and a trillion stars, right? And we're just a little small speck in that huge universe. And yet this is what convinced physicists that there probably is a God, most physicists. So if life is even more precise than that, more finely tuned than that, what's the basis for doubt? Here's Gerald Schroeder, he's a physicist. He says, if the laws of nature created the universe, these laws must have existed prior to time. In other words, the matrix itself must have existed prior to time. That is, the laws of nature would be outside of time. We would then have totally non-physical laws outside of time, creating a universe. Now that description might sound somewhat familiar, very much like the biblical concept of a God, not physical, outside of time, able to create a universe. Roger Penrose, he's an English mathematical physicist and philosopher of science, and he writes, unlike quantum mechanics, M-theory enjoys no observational support whatsoever. Right? In other words, it's a philosophical position. It's almost a religious position, not a scientific or empirically rational position. In fact, the philosophy of M-theory undermines science, right, as we've already talked about. The extreme high level of fine-tuning astronomers and physicists discern powerfully suggests a purpose behind the universe. In other words, it is far more rational to conclude that the empirical evidence in hand best supports the God hypothesis, or the God-only hypothesis. Paul Davies, now he is waffly. He goes back and forth. Sometimes he's agnostic. Sometimes he sort of believes he's a theist. He goes back and forth. But it's very difficult for him because it's so compelling. He says, the temptation, I'm going to read you the full quote. This is just a part of the quote on the slide. The temptation to believe that the universe is a product of some sort of design, a manifestation of subtle aesthetic and mathematical judgment, is overwhelming. The belief that there is something behind it all is one that I personally share with, I suspect, a majority of physicists. This rather diffuse feeling, I suppose, could be termed theism in its widest sense. The force of gravity must be fine-tuned to allow the universe to expand at precisely the right rate. That's 1 in 10 to the power of 120. The fact that the force of gravity just happens to be the right number with such stunning accuracy is surely one of the great mysteries of cosmology. The equations of physics have in them incredible simplicity, elegance, and beauty. That, in itself, is sufficient to prove to me that there must be a God who is responsible for these laws and responsible for the universe. This is Charles Hard Towns, Nobel Prize in Physics, UC Berkeley. He says, this is a very special universe. It's remarkable that it came out just this way. If the laws of physics weren't just the way they are, we couldn't be here at all. Some scientists argue that, well, there's an enormous number of universes. Each one is a little different. This one just happened to turn out right. Well, that's a postulate, and it's a pretty fantastic postulate. It assumes that there really are enormous numbers of universes, and the laws could be different for each one of them. The other possibility is that ours was planned, and that's why it came out so specially. So the other implication is that God is not a physical being, if we accept what most physicists believe and what the Bible claims. If all that is physical is entirely derived from information alone, then God himself is not, in essence, a physical being within our universe. He may reveal himself in physical ways. He can manipulate the physical world. But he is not like us, or unlike us, dependent upon a physical body or a brain for his existence or activity within our universe. In other words, according to John 4:24, God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship him in spirit and in truth. He's not physical. Number 3, God is outside of our time and place. If our universe is nothing but a mental projection on the part of God, then God himself does not live within it, nor is he in any way dependent upon it for his own existence. He exists outside of our time and place, outside of our empirical world. And according to 1 Kings 8:27, King Solomon says, "Will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain you. How much less this temple that I have built?" In other words, even the universe cannot contain God. God is bigger than the universe. The universe exists within the mind of God, not the other way around. It also implies that God knows the future because time itself is a dimension that's created. If God exists outside of our place and time, and if God did in fact create time itself, God knows our future exactly like he knows our past, as in the case of any author of any book. All authors live outside of the time and place of the characters in the book that they have authored. And as an example of this, there's lots of biblical prophecies. One of them in particular, Jesus, for example, predicted the destruction of Jerusalem 70 years or 30-some years before it happened. And he told the future Christians to get out of town when the Romans would withdraw. And how did he know? And he also said the temple would be knocked down stone for stone. How did he know that the gold would melt between the stones and that the Romans would topple these gigantic temple stones, huge tons and tons and tons of stone to get at that gold? And how did he know that the armies would withdraw for a short period of time, allowing the Christians to escape? You cannot just predict that like without being there. You have to have been there in the future to know that that's going to happen. There's this thing called butterfly effect, where for you and me, who don't know everything about what's going on, the more we try to predict farther and farther into the future, the more and more inaccurate we get, because little small variations can disrupt the whole stream of time. So only somebody who's actually there in the future can avoid that butterfly effect and actually know things so precisely as this. And by the way, 600,000 Jews died who stayed in Jerusalem who weren't Christians. Not a single Christian died. They all left. As soon as the Roman armies retreated for no apparent reason, they all left, and none of the Christians died. St. Augustine talks about this quality of God and being outside of time. It's a little hard to follow Augustine. Sometimes his concepts are a little convoluted. But if you think about it slowly and carefully, you can see what he's trying to say. He said, "It is in eternity, which is supreme over time because it's a never-ending present, that you, God, are at once before all past time and after all future time. For what is now future, once it comes, will become past. Whereas you are unchanging. Your years can never fail. Your years neither go or come. But our years pass and others come after them." So God is different than us, fundamentally different. We experience a progression of time, whereas God does not. Einstein also kind of humorously said, "The distinction between the past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion," at least from the physics perspective, but it's stubbornly persistent because we can't jump around in time, right? But theoretically, according to quantum theory, there's no reason why the creator of time couldn't jump around in time. The other implication is that God is eternal. If God lives outside of our time and place, time, as we know it, is meaningless to him. There simply is no beginning or end to someone who invented the very idea of time, as well as all of the fundamental constants of our universe. Hebrews 7:3 says, "God is without beginning of days or end of life." Again, Augustine, he says, "Your years are one day, yet your day does not come daily, but is always today. Because your today does not give place to any tomorrow, nor does it take the place of yesterday. Your today is eternity," which seems to reflect the Bible's constant use of the name of God as I am. Before Abraham was, it doesn't say I was. It says before Abraham was, I am. And when he talked to Moses, he says, "Tell them I am sent you. I am that I am." It's a eternal presence that's right now, always now, wherever you are in time. So it also implies that God is everywhere. If everything exists in the mind of God, if it is in fact true that in him we live and move and have our being, literally true, then it is impossible to go or be anywhere outside of the knowledge and very real presence of God. You can't get lost in this universe. God always knows where you are. It's funny that Jonah actually tried to run away from God. I mean, come on now. There's no way you can go anywhere. And it's comforting in a way to me to know that God is always with me. Regardless, I cannot get lost. And I can't get stolen from his hand unless I myself remove myself, which is interesting because how can someone so powerful who can actually really control everything, even wipe my memory if he wants to, and force me to do things, how can he allow me to have freedom of choice? It's kind of a hard, bizarre concept to get your mind around. Someone so powerful can create freedom of choice. And I can't explain it, how both can exist. Except that the Bible says it, that you're free to choose. Choose you this day whom you will serve. I don't know how that works. But someone so powerful like that, he says, well, I did it. And who am I to say, well, no, you don't, And so I was like, well, that's interesting that someone is that powerful and still creates freedom of choice. Again, God is all-powerful, implied by all this. If everything exists within the mind of God, everything is therefore totally dependent upon God for its existence. There is no escape from God or possibility of independent existence outside of God's existence. God is therefore has absolute power at his disposal over every other aspect of his entire universe. Number 8, God must be a personal God. This idea of a theistic God doesn't make sense, given this mental projection idea of the universe. If everything exists within the mind of God, to include you, then God must be intimately aware of us as individuals, knowing the very hairs of our heads, right? Luke 12:7. Even the atoms, he knows how many atoms, every single possible detail about you. He cannot be a mere watchmaker who simply wound up the universe and let it go to do its own purpose. In fact, everything is continually indebted to God moment by moment for his constant care. It's the moment progression to the next moment actually requires creative power. And I'm not the only one who comes up with this idea. Augustine again, even on the seventh day his power ceased not from ruling heaven and earth and all that he has made, or otherwise they would have perished immediately. For the power and might of the Creator who rules and embraces all makes every creature abide. And if this power ever ceased to govern the creatures, their essences would pass away and all of nature would perish. When a builder puts up a house and departs, his work remains in spite of the fact that he's no longer there. But the universe will pass away in the twinkling of an eye if God withdraws his ruling hand. It's not the same as us building something and walking away. The universe exists within the mind of God. In other words, he can't forget about it. He's always constantly aware of it. Were God to annihilate, in other words, were God cease to exist, it would not be through some action, but through cessation of action. In other words, God has to be actively employed in maintaining the universe. If he stopped actively employing himself in maintaining the universe would cease to exist. Believe, and if possible, understand that God is working even now, so that if his actions should be withdrawn from his creatures, they would perish. And he's not the only one. Augustine, yeah, he's a theologian, but what about somebody else who's more scientifically inclined, like René Descartes? He's a French philosopher, mathematician, scientist, and he's thought by many to be the father of modern Western philosophy, and even current modern Western philosophers study Descartes in detail. Everything, Western philosophy is based on Descartes. And this is what he says about God. For because the entire span of one's life can be divided into countless parts, each one wholly independent of the rest, it does not follow from the fact that I exist a short time ago that I must exist now, unless some cause, as it were, creates me all over again at this moment. That is to say, which preserves me. In other words, he's arguing that God creates you over and over again, moment by moment. He preserves you moment by moment, actively. For it is obvious to one who pays close attention to the nature of time that plainly the same force and action are needed to preserve anything at each individual moment it lasts as would be required to create the same thing anew were it not yet in existence. In other words, it requires the same creative power to start the universe as it does to maintain it moment by moment. There must be at least as much in the cause as there is in the effect, which is something Dawkins doesn't understand. He thinks that you can start with nothing and make everything. Descartes says no, you have to have something at least as significant in the cause as in the effect. If such a power were in me, I would certainly be aware of it, because then you could snap your fingers and speak things into existence too, right? But he cannot, and neither can I, and neither can you. But I observe that there is no such power, and from this very fact I know most certainly that I depend upon a being other than myself. But perhaps this being is not God, and I have been produced either by my parents or by some other causes less perfect than God, like some pimply teenager in the future who's programmed us in his computer. Regardless of what it is that eventually is assigned to my cause, because I am a thinking thing, because Descartes is like, I think, therefore I am, right? That's his famous quote. Because I am a thinking thing and have within me a certain idea of a God, it must be granted that what caused me is also a thinking thing. At least because he's saying that the cause must be at least as great as the effect. And if I'm a thinking thing, the cause must at least be a thinking thing as well, right? I can again inquire of that cause whether it got its existence from itself or another cause. If it got its existence from another cause, I will once again inquire in a similar fashion about the other cause, whether it got its existence from itself or from another cause, until finally I arrive at the ultimate cause, which would be God. Now, some people would accuse him of an infinite regress, like it's turtles all the way down or turtles all the way up. And he's like, no, it's not an infinite regress. You realize that pi, the number pi, is infinitely long in digits, but it's not a random number. It's a precise number that can be precisely defined by a formula. And theoretically, you can reach the end of pi if you go infinitely long. Well, he's arguing the same thing is true about God. God is not an infinite regress. There's a final proof. For it is apparent enough that there can be no infinite regress here, especially since I am not dealing here merely with a cause that once produced me, but also, and most especially, with the cause that preserves me at the present time. So this is the philosophy of science. It's also some of the evidence. There's a lot more to this. I had to really seriously pick and choose what I would present here tonight, because it's a huge concept. And I could go on and on, but the science seems to be fairly convincing. The philosophy seems to be compelling and very similar to the Bible. But what does it mean to me and you on a personal level? Consider that if all this is true, that this supreme being, the Word that has infinite power over you and me and everything else, that can snap his fingers and make things happen, is the one who came and became a man and died for me and you. He was put on the cross, he took the nails, he became not like Adam, not like a really good, even like Adam, it would have been a huge sacrifice to come down to that level. But he came after we've degenerated for a long period of time. We're not evolving, we're degenerating, right? And he came in a degenerative form to suffer like we suffer, in order to experience things like we experience them, and to have sympathy with us. Otherwise, a God who can snap his fingers and make things pop into existence cannot relate with me, right? So Jesus came down, the Word became flesh, so he could relate with me in my position and to save me from where I fell. And because of that, he always remembers us, because he is engraving your name on the palms of his hands. Those scars, he remembers who you are and why he died to save you. It says in Isaiah 49:16, see, I've engraven you on the palms of my hands. Your walls, your person is ever before me. You're constantly on his mind. Greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. It's just amazing to me that somebody like God, who's that powerful, who I existed within his mind, would think of me as his friend. It's so bizarre to think that he calls me a friend, somebody like that. So, what is our response to that kind of condescension on the part of God, and that kind of love and care for us and sacrifice for us? How should we respond? Philippians 2:5-8, he says, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Jesus Christ, who, being in the very form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon himself the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in the fashion of a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross." And that's what we're called to do too. So take up your cross and follow me, right? We're called to be humble. We're called to be servants to our fellow man, and to act like Jesus did for mankind, right? That's our response. That's what Jesus requires of us, to be like him. And if we do this, he promises good things. He has great plans for us. In Jeremiah 29:11, it says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." And let me tell you, I'm glad that God has the plan and not me. Because my plan, I'm a very limited person, right? What good are my plans? I can't even predict the stock market. I got creamed this last year. Anyway, so I'm like, well, I'm sure glad God has it taken care of, right? Because, and that he likes me. He's came down to save me, and he's got good plans for me, plans to give me hope in the future, and you too. Amen. Right? So put yourself in God's hands. The Bible lays before you two paths. One path that you can choose your own way. Make your own plans. And where is that going to lead you? You're going to get toasted, right? Making your own plans. Way worse than I get in the stock market. In Deuteronomy it says, "I have set before you life and death, blessings and cursings. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live." Choose to put yourself in the hands of the Word, somebody who knows the future and has your best interest at heart, who came and died for you and has a great future set aside for you if you just put yourself in his care. So thank you again for having me, and I really had a good time. So hopefully.